What is going on, Governor? It's Chisgule here, and today we're going to talk about Pelagius, who is a smashing cavalry commander, generates a ton of rage, garrison defender, does some healing. I think he's pretty spectacular if you're considering making a cavalry unit. If you like commander guides, you should totally like and subscribe. We've got a bunch of those and more to come. And we are sponsored by the makers of Rise of Civilizations. We do appreciate that sponsorship. When we make a commander guide, we talk about four things. We talk about the skills, we review them in depth because they inform the talents that we might then choose. The third thing we go look at is where you can unlock this commander and how you can skill them up. And lastly, we will give you the pairings that will help you smash on the battlefield. So let's start talking about these skills, and I think there's a lot to be excited about here. The first skill has a direct damage factor at a max of 300, dealing an additional damage factor of 300 per second for 2 seconds. That's 900 damage total, and restores 100 rage, and that's important. That rage restoration is big. We'll talk about that in a minute. Next up is a passive skill that increases the cavalry attack and defense by 10%. Next up increases the garrison and watchtower attack by a maximum of 7%. Next up is the Mutineer, kind of a cool name for a passive skill. Troops' normal attacks have a 10% chance to heal some amount of slightly wounded units, healing factor 450 per second for 2 seconds. So that's 900 healing factor total, which is actually pretty good. The expertise skill further increases the effectiveness of our second skill, and that makes it so that our cavalry attack and defense is boosted by a total of 15%. Now, overall, these skills point us in the direction of rage restoration being a powerful mechanism or engine for our good friend Pelagius. Now, the talents also support this path. There's a cavalry tree, a garrison tree, and a skill tree. And we'll talk about the skill tree first, because this tree is what builds off of Pelagius's rage generation, because the skill, or rather the talent, rejuvenate, increases rage restoration whenever you use a skill. Burning Blood grants additional rage from normal attacks. And lastly, Feral Nature makes it so that you've got a 10% chance at max level to gain 100 rage. That's, I think, kind of like 10 rage a second on average. But what makes that skill really interesting is there's no limit to how frequently it can go off. So it actually operates much differently than an average of 10 rage per second. Now, the reason I like these rage generation talents is that when Pelagius uses his active skill, he generates rage. And by using that active skill, Rejuvenate gives even more rage restoration. And you've heard me talk about this in other videos. You build an engine, and that engine is powerful. I'll have a link in the description about my rage tanking build. Pelagius could totally be a part of that, maybe more of a rage smashing build than a rage tanking build. So, if I were putting talent points into Pelagius and I didn't have full cavalry, the choice here is very, very easy. If you're using him as a primary commander, I would go into Burning Blood first, grabbing all of the required talents for that. I would then make my way to Rejuvenate, grabbing all of the required talents for that. You then make your way immediately to Clarity, and finally, Feral Nature, capping out this tree. From there, moving into the cavalry talents is kind of interesting. Now, it's worth noting that some of these talents apply to all commanders, or rather all types of units, regardless of whether or not you have full cavalry. So I'll call out Dragon Saber, increasing the attack of all troops. This does do cavalry attack, but all the way in the left here is Undying Fury, which gives you even more rage generation. So if I were moving in the direction of still not being able to field a full cavalry army, but I have more talent points, that's the route I would go. If you did have full cavalry, or even not, and you're using this commander for PvP, this talent here, Charge, is actually quite exceptional. When the army's been reduced by less than 50% strength, it increases the march speed by a maximum of 30%. This says nothing about cavalry or not. It's very powerful, actually, to get away. And if you've been reduced to below 50%, you probably need to be getting away if you're battling other players. Now, if you were building a full cavalry unit, and you wanted to go full cavalry, which I actually would not recommend in this case because I think Pelagius really does lend himself to the skill tree over the cavalry tree. The direction I would go is as follows. I would start by getting the march speed talent all the way up to the right and maxing that out. I would then get the march speed talent to the left. From there, I would pick up disarm, and then I would get emblazoned shield. Finally, getting rallying cry. We're essentially getting all of the required talents to accomplish this. That's the order I would do it in. You could then consider dropping just 3 more points into Undying Fury, which I think is a really good choice. The reason I don't recommend that you do that sooner is that it makes it a whole heck of a lot longer for you to get this top talent, which I think is pretty good. I think Equestrian Excellence also is a worthy consideration. However, if you have a lot of talent points, I would use your Overflow to make your way in to grab Burning Blood and then Rejuvenate. Now, the final option for this commander is to go the route of the Garrison Leader. And if you were to do that, I think it would mean that you either are not using this commander as the primary, or the other really good reason is you're using a talent reset because you're about to get attacked and you're going to stay to defend. These talents are very, very strong in helping you defend any point on the map. And I spend so little time doing that, I really don't think it's worth having a commander specialized in this all the time. So I'm not even going to talk about the build. We're actually going to make a separate video in the not too distant future about garrison commanders and which ones might be the best. For now, grab these talents if you think you're about to be attacked and use a talent reset to do it. I generally would not focus there. In fact, more often than not, you're better avoiding the combat than being in a situation where you need those talents. So with that said, if I've convinced you that Pelagius is a good inclusion for your roster, and I think it is a good inclusion, here are the skills in the order I would recommend leveling up those skills in order to get maximum value. I would start by maxing out the first skill, and I would try not to leveling them up any further than that until this skill is maxed out. From there, I would max out the second skill, and then I would level this commander all the way to 30 so that you unlock both the garrison skill and the healing skill, and that's when I would start to apply the final points onto this leader. If we take a look here at where you can get these sculptures, thankfully he's obtainable in all the usual places. You can get a full unlock in the tavern from keys, specifically the gold keys, and you also can get this commander in the expedition. There's a weekly rotation for which epic commander shows up. He's on that rotation, and occasionally he'll show up in the rotational shop below that as well. You can use universal commander sculptures on this commander after you have them unlocked. So, with all of that said, who are the pairings? Who do you put this guy with to totally smash on the battlefield? And you've got a bunch of really good options. I'll start at the epic tier, and then we'll go to the legendary tier. Now, in the epic tier, there really aren't any other cavalry commanders. So you're looking at pairing Pelagius optimally with someone who is a good generalist, someone who's good regardless of whether or not a specific type of unit is in the army, because Pelagius cares about cavalry, and you want to put a bunch of cavalry into this army, even if you use the skill tree entirely. Now, I think Lohar and Pelagius is an amazing combination for battling barbarians. You would use Pelagius as the secondary in that configuration, and you could really smash. Boudica is also an exceptional pairing because she has rage generation with her third skill. So I think she would be an exceptional pairing as either primary or secondary because she also has the skill tree. I think there's some amount of anti-synergy with commanders such as Kusunoki, Herman, and Ulji Mundak because they care about other types of units, archers and infantry respectively. So I think that's not such a phenomenal pairing, but I do think Joan of Arc is a great pairing With Pelagius, the rage generation is 100% on plan from Joan of Arc's first skill, which makes that unit have a very strong rage generation engine. I'm a huge fan of that. The final option here at the epic tier would be CPO, and CPO is interesting for making your unit a little more defensive. CPO doesn't have the skill tree, so in that case, I would be using CPO as the secondary commander rather than the primary. Now, there is actually one more commander I haven't talked about yet that is a surprisingly good pairing, and that is Sun Tzu. And even though Sun Tzu specializes in infantry, this first skill from Sun Tzu does an area of effect, and for every target hit, it restores 50 rage, which is kind of a big deal for building that rage engine that Pelagius has. In addition, the fourth skill on Sun Tzu increases active skill damage, which is a pretty good pairing with our good friend Pelagius. Now, I think this only increases the 300 damage from the primary attack, not the additional skill damage, but I still think this pairing is very good simply for the rage restoration and that rage generation alone. Now, in this case, there actually is a consideration at the uh, blue tier, elite, I believe is what it is. Took me a second. Advanced, elite, epic, legendary. Lancelot is an interesting choice because he's also a cavalry commander, and he offers a tree that Pelagius can't get, and that is the mobility tree. Now, if what you want to be doing is kind of running all around the battlefield to have very, very high mobility, but maybe hit less hard, you could have Lancelot as the primary commander because the talents contained within the mobility tree are really good for getting around the battlefield. My video yesterday talked about that, and I'll have a link, of course, in the description so you can go check that out. Dragon Lancer is an honorable mention, but I'm not going to recommend Dragon Lancer at this time. Dragon Lancer, I mean, I guess I'll show, is an advanced commander, and what's interesting here is that every single one of the skills is actually very relevant for cavalry, except maybe the first one. This is not what you're trying to accomplish with this pairing. Now, if we go into the legendary tier, there's a couple pairings that do make a lot of sense. One would be Minamoto, and Minamoto is almost identical with respect to the talent trees as Pelagius, except Minamoto has a peacekeeping tree. So against barbarians, you might want to use Minamoto as the primary and Pelagius as the secondary. In a PvP context, there's also some advantages to the mobility that's available to you from the peacekeeping tree of all places. But I would probably stick to using Minamoto as the secondary because legendaries take twice as much experience to level up as an advanced commander. Not quite that much more than an epic, but enough that I would consider doing the epic over the legendary. And the final option here is Cao Cao. You can see I personally am putting a lot of investment into Cao Cao. Cao Cao has the mobility tree, very similar to Lancelot in that way, and has the peacekeeping tree as well. Good as a primary if what you want to do is either be battling barbarians or if what you want to be doing is to be highly mobile on the battlefield. There are, of course, other legendary commanders you could be looking at that don't have cavalry-specific skills. That includes Richard I, Charles Martel, Caesar, Frederick, and El Cid. I would immediately rule out El Cid for his focus on archers and the anti-synergy there. You could pair with Richard I because Richard I is basically bananas in any army that has rage generation and rage restoration. He heals so fast it's insane. So I think that actually is a deceptively good pairing, although Richard I kind of works anywhere. You could consider Charles Martel, but I don't think the synergy is particularly strong. The rage generation synergy-ish is good. I say synergy-ish because Charles Martel just benefits by, and as does every commander, with generating a lot of rage, so you use their primary skill more frequently. I think there's actually perhaps a little bit more synergy with Caesar, who, with the primary skill, makes it so that for the next 5 seconds, you have boosted attack. This is really good if you use Julius Caesar as the primary. That way, the nuke from Pelagius benefits, but I think the synergy is really just okay and not out of this world. And the same is also true with Frederick, who Makes it so that for the next 3 seconds, all attacks have an 80% chance to deal additional damage. Like, there's not particularly strong synergy here, but by virtue of being a legendary commander, I mean, like, they're strong, but I think you can find better synergy in general. Pelagius lends himself toward making a army that hits incredibly hard, and I think is really, really good for that. If I wasn't invested in cavalry at the legendary tier, this is who I would be working with, likely with Minamoto as the backup. I'll be eager to hear how you are using Pelagius and what success you're having with him on the battlefield. And if there's anything I missed, please do leave it in the comments. I'm a relatively new content creator, so your likes, your subscription means a whole heck of a lot to me. And until next time, my friends, you have fun smashing the kingdom.